Well, hello everybody. So I want to talk very quickly about minimum wage and the policies and principles behind it, and that it isn't needed technically ever, and it will always just cause things to become more and more expensive. Why don't people understand this about minimum wage when it actually is a very easy thing to figure? It's because of three big reasons. One, not terribly good at the math part. Two, not terribly good at understanding incentives when it comes to praxeology, that is, the study of human action. And number three, unable to calculate multiple variables within an economic system. In other words, taking a look at other factors that lead into what happens with minimum wage. Now, before anybody gets offended, be like, oh my gosh, well, I don't believe in it. I'm good at math or this or that. Let's just take a brief tour of what I'm talking about so we can really understand what actually happens. Whenever minimum wage is raised by law, what that does is it forces businesses to pay a person at a minimum a certain wage. Pretty simple, pretty almost self-explanatory. Well, what happens there is that when someone is paid higher, those expenses are taken out of what the company money is, and that may be money that could be used for other things such as development, growing the business, research, or even padding the salaries of the executives. But that's an aside for now. Actually, if you ever take someone's salaries executive and you look at it across products, it's literally about I think it's like 1/10,000th of a percent or a penny of each product, but that's an aside. That's a math problem. So when you take a look at all these things and what happens when you move up those minimum prices that someone needs to pay, you see that people who have certain skill sets that typically are on the lower end of skilled worker are no longer picked up for hire, because what happens is typically employers demand more of employees that are currently there, or they offer up more opportunities to those who have more skills there, or there's just not a reason to grow because having somebody do something janitorial or something of that other nature is just not worth the extra expense, the nicety of it. It's just not in the business incentive to grow. And even if you get to a certain point, as someone jests, but it's actually, it's very true, you get to a certain point where technology outpaces the human ability, then you get things like automated tellers and automated, I guess you could say, fast food checkout, machines, robots, things that look like ATMs, but they can process your food orders. And that's exactly what happens. Eventually, there becomes a maximum where the human element is no longer worth the expense. That happens with everything. Eventually, it becomes it's not worth it. You can find technology, you can delegate responsibility to work more effectively or efficiently, or you can just stunt your growth or move to a different area. So the people for which this minimum wage policy hurts the most are those who don't have that much in terms of skill set. But traditionally, this meant younger people were taking up the initial post. Minimum wage was often reserved for people that were maybe in high school, sometimes in middle school. I worked high school, middle school to get skills and learn business. But that goes away, and that opportunity goes away, and now there's this big gap where only those who already have money can get experience, or in some cases, only the rich can have internships, because they're the only people that can afford to have quote-unquote unpaid internships, or even volunteer work, which is often the case. People get the volunteer work in, and then they don't get paid, and then that's how they get their experience. But they can come from wealthier families who can, give them a nice car, a nice house, so that they can go and get this unpaid work. And sadly, that's what it looks like for a lot of lawyers too right now. A lot of unpaid work periods in order to get the experience after law school. So now we've looked a little bit at the human incentive part, a little bit of the finances part. Let's take a look at the other factors part. What happens with the total economic systems part is that when the government restricts the ability for people to innovate, the barrier to entry, as you might say, through regulations, through licensing fees and things like that, through restricting the exploitation of natural resources, then what you have to do in order to get to the point of being able to be in business becomes impossible for most people. What does that look like? Well, let's just do a microcosm, simple, silly little example, very typical economic example, and that's a lemonade stand. Imagine this. Someone very simply wants to go to the store, they go by the store, they buy some lemonade mix, they mix it in special way, very low cost, they sit at a corner right outside their home, and they're like, lemonade 50 cents. Basically, an arbitrage deal. They're buying and selling just on the fact that it happens to be there at the right place at the right time. Somebody wants it. It's a hot summer day. Well, if the government comes in and says, okay, well now in order to have this stand, you have to have this minimum type of stand, which costs $100 instead of the cheap one that you have at home. You have to have a licensing fee that you have to pay each year, which is $100. And the person doesn't have the money for it. You have to take this certain class about how to process lemonade out of the can, which takes time and money. And eventually start to get to this point where someone who is truly poor can't afford to actually jump those barriers and to grow the economy and to grow business. And what happens is, as you can see in America, you start to get people that can't jump the barrier, and eventually you get about 47 million people on welfare. Because the expenses, the barriers to entry to do anything on the legal sense is just impossible for people to surmount effectively. Entrepreneurship is dead for a lot of these lower economically ended people. And those trends can never be overcome without getting experience, getting the opportunity in the market. And you'll actually notice in my experience in dealing with law, most people who start businesses are so not compliant with the law. It is insane. It really is. A lot of people who start businesses, it's really scary, but when you think about it, for them at least, they start their businesses totally in not complying with federal law, state law, county law. It's very rare that someone does that. And usually it's only someone who's coming from a huge amount of money. In other words, they have a bank loan, they have investors, they have a business plan, they have someone taking care of legal, HR, all that stuff. But small businesses, people selling stuff out of their trucks, selling stuff in the corner, oh my gosh, it is never compliant. And that happens whenever you start to see minimum wage rise, whenever you start to see regulations rise, you start to see a huge black market. You start to see what's called agorism, people acting outside of the system. And that's just the natural end. And most people really, everyone's a criminal by the law. Everybody's a criminal as far as violation of law, whether it's as small as, speeding to, you didn't pay your taxes and everything or whatever. You just can't comply. And the minimum wage is just one more of these things where the barriers that are created for people to actually get experience and get in and get paid for it just creates a huge gap of people who have lower skills that are never going to move up. They just can't. They can't afford to unless you already come from money and then you can go and volunteer for a year and be like, oh, I'm in the Peace Corps or something like that. It's just going to keep growing. Or they'll be stuck in a very low-ended minimum wage job for a long time, and they won't ever get moved up because they can't afford to go start their own business. They can't afford to go and maybe get lesser pay, but to do something more advanced or get more management experience. And that's the rise to the top. The minimum wage can never rise people out of poverty because as long as there's not a ceiling as well, business owners just raise prices accordingly. Everybody else then suffers. So, that's why if you go over to Europe, minimum wage is really high there, but you're going to pay $10 for a burger. Whereas in America, you might pay $2. It's like, great, okay, you're making $10, $15, $20 an hour, if we're talking about France and other places, or the respective currency. But the prices of food there are just through the roof. It makes sense because as long as businesses are not also then kept from raising prices, they're just going to pass it on to the customer. It's just pure human incentive study. And of course, if you do flatten and make a ceiling in prices like some New York City apartments are, eventually people go out of business. There comes a point where if the government's continuing to regulate and to add more laws, as has been in the United States, people can then eventually just not afford anything. Their personal costs are too high. They can't raise the ceiling on their products, whether that's services or goods. They go out of business. Massive failure. So taking this whole picture again, the 3 points, we're going to talking about the human incentive part. We're talking about the business part as far as what actually happens. We're talking about the monetary aspect, that you do the numbers and do the math, what happens when prices raise, a bit of wage goes up. And we're talking about the other economic factors again. It's what happens with the government at the same time when the regulation starts to grow. If possibly you could raise minimum wage, but you also have to then reduce government intervention to see an artificial growth in wealth. And that would be artificial because eventually there will be a leveling out between that one regulation versus these other ones taken away. What's happening in the United States with that picture in mind is we're seeing growth in efficiency. Technology increases efficiency, increases savings. When you have a computer software that does what took 2 people 2 weeks to do in 2 minutes, you have this massive savings. And that's going to continue to happen. And that will continue to create this artificial you could say bubble, but as long as those regulations keep increasing, the actual bottom line wealth, and bottom line wealth, as I define it, is the abundance of inexpensive water, food, shelter, basic needs items that, and of course technically medical, that once those are met, everything else in life could be considered. You can't think about movies if you can't eat. Can't think about can't think about going to the circus or to Disney if you can't afford a drink. You can't really get out of bed to do anything if you're always sick. So those basic human level needs need to be met. And right now you have technology that's helping to kind of increase the efficiency, to create this artifice of, okay, things are okay at the moment, but it will eventually be destroyed, especially as regulations have been going exponentially to the roof. 40,000 laws new each year. Obamacare is going to definitely do that too. But what seemed like otherwise, tyrannical countries now are huge opportunities for people, at least in the economic sense. It may not be perfect for civil liberties, but Singapore, Hong Kong, Chile, there's places across the globe that are really looking really good for people that want to do business. Even it's sadly even in some respects China. So that's kind of the capstone summary of the economics, incentives, and the other regulatory aspects of minimum wage. Minimum wage is really kind of a joke because, as always, the money gets passed on an expense to the consumer. That's what businesses do. And if there's, of course, as I just said, there's a ceiling as to what someone can charge, like a rent ceiling is the most common example. Eventually, someone goes out of business with the rising expenses, especially with inflation factored. Or they maybe have a long period of stagnation. They can't grow. They're stuck. They're stuck. We can't do anything more. We're actually barely getting by. So I hope that was informative, helpful, kind of fleshed out your thinking on minimum wage, and I will talk to you later.